My spouse's remorse over seeking an open marriage as an excuse for infidelity, culminating in a tragic conclusion for her. Elizabeth sat by the window, her gaze lost in the autumn hues of the city park across their street. Her coffee had long since turned cold, forgotten in the midst of her deep contemplation. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock, marking the passage of time with an almost taunting regularity. Arthur, her husband of 7 years, watched her from the doorway. He could sense the waves of restlessness emanating from her, a familiar aura that had become more pronounced over the past few months. "Liz," he ventured gently, using his endearing nickname for her. Startled from her reverie, Elizabeth turned, offering a faint smile. "Just thinking," she replied, her voice a soft murmur. Arthur moved to sit beside her, his concern evident. "About us?" he asked, his hand finding hers. She nodded, the gesture slow and deliberate. "Arthur, I've been feeling confined. Trapped, almost. I love you, you know that. But I feel like we're missing out on life. On experiences." Arthur's brow furrowed. "I thought we were happy, Liz. What is it that you think we're missing?" It was a conversation Elizabeth had rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind, yet now, faced with Arthur's earnest and loving gaze, the words felt heavier, more consequential. "I've been thinking about how we've never really explored beyond us. What if we considered an open relationship?" The words hung in the air, dense and loaded with unspoken fears and uncertainties. Arthur's hand tensed in hers. "An open relationship? Liz, are you not happy with me?" Elizabeth rushed to reassure him. "No, it's not about happiness. It's about exploration, about experiences. We got together so young, Arthur. Don't you ever wonder what else is out there?" Arthur looked away, a troubled expression clouding his features. He was a man of simple joys, their life together, he had always thought, was fulfilling. "But I love our life, Elizabeth. I love you. Isn't that enough?" Elizabeth's heart ached at his words, but she pushed on, propelled by a desire she couldn't fully articulate. "I love you too, more than anything. But love isn't always about holding on tight. It's sometimes about letting go, exploring, and trusting each other enough to come back together." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of tense conversation and tentative negotiations. Elizabeth, with a mixture of persuasive charm and earnest passion, painted a picture of a relationship unshackled by societal norms, free and ever-evolving. Arthur, for his part, was torn. His love for Elizabeth was the anchor of his existence, and the thought of sharing her, even in theory, was agonizing. Yet, the fear of losing her entirely if he refused was even greater. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room, Arthur finally nodded, a gesture more of resignation than agreement. "If this is what you need, Liz, I'll try. For us." Elizabeth felt a surge of relief, mingled with a twinge of guilt. She reached out, cupping Arthur's face in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning in to kiss him, a kiss that tasted bittersweet with the unspoken uncertainties of the path they were now set to tread. That evening, as Arthur sat alone in the dimly lit room, the weight of their decision pressed heavily on him. He stared at the empty chair where Elizabeth had sat that morning, her words echoing in his mind, a harbinger of the changes to come. Arthur sat at the kitchen table, his morning coffee steaming forgotten in front of him. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow through the window. It had been a few weeks since Elizabeth's proposition of an open relationship, a concept that still sat uneasily with him. He reflected on the recent changes. Elizabeth seemed more vibrant, more alive than he had seen her in years. She went out more, often returning late with a sparkle in her eyes that was both intriguing and unsettling to Arthur. He tried to feel happy for her newfound sense of freedom, but a gnawing sense of loss kept him awake at night. In an attempt to embrace this new arrangement, Arthur had tentatively started meeting new people. There was Clara, a colleague from work who had shown interest in him. She was kind and easy to talk to, and for brief moments, he could almost forget the complexity of his situation. But every time he returned home to Elizabeth, the reality of their agreement hit him anew. One evening, as Arthur prepared dinner, Elizabeth breezed into the kitchen. "I won't be home for dinner tonight," she announced, a hint of excitement in her voice. "I'm meeting someone." Arthur nodded, trying to mask the tightness in his chest. "Have fun," he managed, his voice steady. As the door closed behind her, he sat down at the table, suddenly devoid of appetite. The silence of the house enveloped him, a stark reminder of the loneliness that had begun to creep into his heart. Over the next few weeks, Arthur threw himself into his work and his budding friendship with Clara. He found solace in their conversations, in the normalcy of their interactions. Clara, unaware of the complexities of his marital situation, provided a comforting escape from the turbulence at home. Then, one evening, as he and Clara laughed over a shared joke at a local cafe, a realization dawned on him. He was enjoying himself, genuinely and without reservation. The laughter, the conversation, the connection he felt with Clara, it was all real. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. Back home, Elizabeth's adventures had started to lose their initial sheen. She began to notice the subtle changes in Arthur. He seemed more confident, more at ease with himself. The dull ache of envy started to form in her chest as she watched him on the phone with Clara, smiling genuinely. One night, as they lay in bed, Elizabeth turned to Arthur. "How are things going with Clara?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Arthur looked at her, a softness in his eyes. "Good, actually. She's wonderful." Elizabeth felt a pang in her heart. She had wanted freedom, but she hadn't anticipated this, Arthur finding happiness elsewhere. The roles had reversed, and she found herself on the unfamiliar ground. As she watched Arthur drift into a peaceful sleep, Elizabeth lay awake, her thoughts swirling. She had wanted to explore, to experience more of life, but at what cost? The distance between them, once an exciting prospect, now felt like an unbridgeable chasm. The next morning, Elizabeth watched Arthur leave for work, his farewell kiss lingering a moment longer than usual. As she stood in the quiet of their home, a sense of foreboding settled over her. She had set these events in motion, but now, as she watched Arthur find his own path, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a grave mistake. Elizabeth sat alone in the dim light of the living room, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The initial thrill of her newfound freedom had started to fade, leaving behind a trail of complications and unanticipated consequences. She reflected on her recent encounters, realizing they lacked the depth and comfort of her relationship with Arthur. Meanwhile, Arthur's life was taking a different turn. His relationship with Clara had deepened, evolving into something more meaningful than he had anticipated. He found in her a kindred spirit, someone who listened to his dreams and fears without judgment. Their connection was a stark contrast to the growing distance he felt with Elizabeth. At work, Elizabeth began to notice the whispers and sideways glances from her colleagues. Rumors about her personal life had started to spread, tainting her professional reputation. She felt exposed and vulnerable, a far cry from the empowered woman she had envisioned herself to be in this new phase of her life. One evening, as Elizabeth returned home from another unfulfilling encounter, she found Arthur and Clara laughing together in the kitchen. They were preparing dinner, their ease and intimacy with each other unmistakable. Elizabeth felt like an outsider in her own home, a sensation that left her heart aching. She retreated to her room, feeling a mix of jealousy and regret. The realization that Arthur was moving on, possibly even finding love, was more painful than she had ever imagined. She lay in bed, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter from the kitchen, each burst of joy a sharp reminder of what she was losing. Arthur, on the other hand, found himself torn. His feelings for Clara had grown stronger, yet he couldn't shake off his commitment to Elizabeth. He knew he had to make a choice, but the thought of hurting either woman filled him with dread. The next day at work, Elizabeth faced a humiliating moment when her boss called her into his office. He expressed concern about the rumors circulating and how they were affecting her performance and the company's image. Elizabeth left the meeting feeling professionally compromised and personally embarrassed. That night, Arthur and Elizabeth sat in silence over dinner. The air was thick with unspoken words and suppressed emotions. Arthur finally broke the silence. "Liz, we need to talk about us," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know," she whispered. They talked late into the night, both expressing their fears, frustrations, and desires. For the first time in months, they truly listened to each other. But the divide between them had grown too wide, the hurt too deep. As they went to bed, Elizabeth lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She realized her quest for freedom and adventure had cost her the most important thing in her life, her relationship with Arthur. She had underestimated the strength of their bond and overestimated her own desires. The next morning, Elizabeth woke up to find Arthur's side of the bed empty. A note on the pillow caught her eye. It was from Arthur, explaining his decision to spend some time away to clear his head. Sitting alone in the quiet room, Elizabeth felt the full weight of her choices. She had set out to find herself but ended up losing the one person who had always been her anchor. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, and she knew that the path ahead would be one of introspection and healing. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. Elizabeth sat at the edge of the bed, Arthur's note still clutched in her hand. The emptiness of the house echoed the hollow feeling in her chest. Arthur's decision to leave, even temporarily, was a wake-up call. She had never imagined their open relationship experiment would lead them here. Meanwhile, Arthur found solace in Clara's company. She provided a haven from the storm that his life had become. With Clara, he discovered a sense of peace and understanding that he hadn't felt in a long time. Their relationship, which had started as a reluctant step into the world of open relationships, was now a source of strength for Arthur. Back at work, Elizabeth struggled to maintain her professional facade. The rumors had escalated, and she could feel the judgmental stares of her colleagues. Her performance suffered, leading to a critical project being taken away from her. The professional fallout of her personal life choices was becoming painfully evident. One evening, Elizabeth decided to confront the situation head-on. She went out with the intention of rekindling the excitement she had initially sought in the open relationship. However, the night turned sour when she ran into some colleagues at a bar. Their thinly veiled judgment and pitying looks were more than she could bear. She left the bar feeling more alone than ever. The following days were a blur for Elizabeth. She oscillated between trying to salvage her professional reputation and dealing with the loneliness at home. The absence of Arthur's presence was a constant reminder of the cost of her actions. As Arthur spent more time with Clara, he began to envision a future with her. Clara's understanding and acceptance were a stark contrast to the complex and strained relationship he had with Elizabeth. The thought of starting anew, though painful, seemed increasingly appealing. The climax of Elizabeth's downward spiral came one fateful evening. After a particularly challenging day at work, she returned home to find a letter from Arthur. He had written about his feelings for Clara and his desire to explore a life with her. He expressed his love for Elizabeth but also his need to find happiness. The letter was a physical manifestation of all her fears. The realization that she had pushed Arthur away, that he had found happiness with someone else, was devastating. Elizabeth spent the night going through old photos and memories, each one a reminder of the life they had built together. In the days that followed, Elizabeth tried to reach out to Arthur, but he was distant. His heart was already elsewhere, and the gap between them seemed insurmountable. Elizabeth knew she had to let him go, but the thought of it was unbearable. As Elizabeth grappled with her new reality, she received another blow. She was demoted at work due to her declining performance and the negative attention she had brought to the company. Her professional life, much like her personal life, had crumbled. The chapter ends with Elizabeth sitting in her now half-empty home, surrounded by the remnants of her life with Arthur. The silence was deafening. She realized that in her quest for something more, she had lost everything that truly mattered. The pain of her choices was a lesson learned too late, and she was left to rebuild her life from the ruins of her decisions. The early morning light crept through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room now stripped of its familiarity. Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table, a lone figure amidst the silence of the house that once echoed with laughter and love. The past weeks had been a testament to her unraveling, both personal and professional. The finality of Arthur's departure hung heavy in the air. Arthur had moved out completely, leaving behind only memories that clung to the walls like shadows. His final goodbye had been gentle yet resolute, a closure to their shared past. He was building a new life with Clara, one that Elizabeth knew she had no part in. In the solitude of the house, Elizabeth grappled with the magnitude of her losses. Her career was in shambles, reduced to a mere shadow of the promise it once held. Her colleagues' respect, which she had worked so hard to earn, had evaporated under the scorching scrutiny of her personal choices. But above all, the loss of Arthur, her partner, her confidant, her best friend, was the most devastating. The days passed in a monotonous blur. Elizabeth tried to regain some sense of normalcy, but the emptiness was overwhelming. She attempted to reconnect with old friends, but their lives had moved on, leaving her feeling like an outsider looking in. The world she once knew seemed to have contracted, leaving her isolated in a self-made purgatory. One afternoon, as she sifted through a box of old photographs, Elizabeth stumbled upon a picture from their honeymoon. Arthur's arm was around her, both of them radiant with youthful optimism. The contrast between that moment and her current reality was stark. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of her choices came crashing down. She had sought freedom but found only desolation in its wake. Elizabeth realized that her journey towards self-discovery had been misguided. In her pursuit of something elusive, she had overlooked the treasure she already possessed. The irony of her situation was a bitter pill to swallow. The freedom she had craved now felt like an oppressive burden. In an attempt to find some semblance of purpose, Elizabeth began to volunteer at a local community center. It was a humble start, but it gave her days structure and a reason to step outside her cocoon of regret. Helping others brought a small sense of fulfillment, a flicker of light in the darkness of her world. As weeks turned into months, Elizabeth slowly started to rebuild her life. She made peace with the fact that her career path had changed and embraced the new direction. The work at the community center, though not glamorous, provided her with a sense of accomplishment. But the nights were still long, filled with echoes of her choices. The empty side of the bed was a constant reminder of the love she had lost. She would often lie awake, thinking about Arthur and Clara, wondering about their life together. Did they ever think of her? Did they find the happiness that had eluded her? The final scene of the chapter shows Elizabeth sitting by the window, looking out at the world moving on around her. She had come to understand that some choices leave indelible marks, shaping our lives in irreversible ways. Her quest for more had cost her everything, and now she was left with the echoes of those choices, a poignant reminder of the delicate balance between freedom and the ties that bind us to those we love. The chapter, and the story, ends with Elizabeth slowly turning away from the window, a symbol of her acceptance of the past and her tentative steps towards an uncertain future.